It's open. And where's the clicker? This is forward. Okay. Hi, my name is Siobhan. I'm from York University in Toronto, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about this idea of environmental imaginaries. Okay. I want to say thank you, first of all, to everybody for being here so late in the meeting, and to the organizers for the wonderful work that you've done. It's been a fantastic conference, and I've gotten an awful lot out of it, certainly. So thanks to everybody, presenters included. I especially want to thank Dr. Palacio for his opening remarks yesterday morning, because they helped to reaffirm the way in which I've been thinking about some of these complex issues in the fieldwork site where I'm working. Okay? It's a complex situation, and I'm trying to navigate my way through being a critical thinker without being a critical person. Right? There are no rights and wrongs in the scenario in which I find myself observing, and yet there's a lot of tensions and there's a lot of different sides and factions that are working against one another. So I'm just going to recap or paraphrase a few of the things that he said, because that helps to set up how I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about these complex issues, I guess. So he started out by suggesting that we need to keep in mind the darkness of colonialism, and that we need to recognize the slippery, scary slope that Belize travels en route to development. We need to nurture an unambiguous dedication to Belize, and this is going to necessitate that any divisions that are fostered through colonialism need to be downplayed, and that whatever differences remain need to be overcome. This includes lines of social separation and geographic distance. So in order to do this, he implored us to focus on and build expertise in a number of areas, including poverty and its perpetuation, and that includes the attention to the ways in which poverty is disproportionately affecting Black, female, and Indigenous Maya and Garifuna populations. We need to attend to the workings of the political structure, the culture of corruption that exists, to be aware of climate change, and to think carefully about issues of land and the ways in which some well-connected Belizeans and foreigners are encouraging the sale and thus the loss of important traditional lands and keys. And in the comments over the last 2 days, we keep coming back to the issue of the importance of land. So clearly this is something we're all thinking about and working towards. Let me see if I can work this. Maybe not. Go backwards? Nope. It's not working though.
No, the other one.
That one?
Yeah, that
Okay.
one's fine. I think.
Press it hard. Okay, thank you. Sorry. All right, so there we go. All right, so brief outline. Thinking critically through these issues, I had to find a way again to navigate through the complexities, and I've chosen environmental imaginaries as one way in my dissertation to think about these things. I'll be using a concept by an Italian scholar named Vittoria De Palma to explain what is referred to as the wasteland. The wasteland helps to explain one of the geographic imaginaries I'm addressing, which is the swampy backwater. I also look at the lived-on local fishing beach as an environmental imaginary, and then the paradise beach, and consider the ways in which these things, these different imaginaries come into contact with one another and the kinds of conflicts that they create. All right, there we go. All right, when I'm explaining to people outside of the institution what I'm working on, a simple way to explain it is that it's the gentrification of a beach. Now, this isn't theoretically the thing that I'm talking about, but it's an easy way for people to understand sort of the process that's working in my field site, which is Hopkins. Right? So the process by which a poor neighborhood in a city is changed by people who have money, including or especially the improvement or replacement of buildings. Right? So it's gentrification processes, but not gentrification specifically. So I'll start with a little story. Less than 4 days had passed after I returned home from my ethnographic fieldwork in a coastal village in southern Belize when I received a text from the friend of a friend. "When will you be back?" "I'll be back in December. We'll look for a ticket on Wednesday." "Liston told me you wanted to buy land in the village." "I want to build a house," I texted. "For sure. But I don't know about owning land. That's a tricky thing for me. I think that land is for the Garifuna. I could be happy leasing land. We'll see. Why? Do you have some? LOL. Oh yeah, my mother wants me to sell you hers, so just asking. As soon as I saw that name on the phone, and before I even read the initial text, I knew that she had land that she was looking to sell. Because the land in the village is always for sale if someone has enough money. I'd spent the last year carefully talking to people about the issues emerging from the processes of population growth, real estate transactions, and housing construction by middle-class or affluent foreigners in an area that belonged to an indigenous and once or still marginalized population of traditional fishers and farmers. These issues included competing social and economic values of the beach, the expansion of the community's physical borders and into the surrounding mangroves as its demographic numbers swelled, the increasing pressure for land, environmental transformations resulting from cutting the mangrove and filling in swamp waters to accommodate the steady arrival of new, paradise-bound snowbirds and lifestyle migrants. Dredging and mining in order to fill those mangrove swamps, the relatively recent desire of outsiders to live on the seashore in the Caribbean, and then the cultural conflicts occurring as the local villagers faced a land shortage, the threat of displacement, and an economic surge in land values. As I've stated, the village isn't isolated in feeling the pressure of the changing coast and shore. Worldwide, there's more people living on the coast today than ever before. And while there's no clear statistics or numbers about how many people are on the coast, there are some who estimate that the number is in billions. Right? There's been a 30% increase in the United States, in Australia, and in Europe since the 1980s of people living on coasts. And it's clear in the literature that beachfront land in warm climates is the most desired form of real estate. As early as the 1980s, 75% to 80% of Belize's coastal land was already owned by foreigners who were seeking to develop it for the resorts, condominiums, and residential property markets. Coastal migration is occurring even as we learn about climate change and sea level, even as these start to make more sense to us. As the amount of available land decreases with rising water and erosion events, it's also decreasing due to crowding. This decreasing land is known as coastal squeeze. It emerges from competition for resources, attention, and space. With regard to the coastal squeeze, the concern is not how we're supposed to manage the environment, but how to decide what features of the coast are worth saving. Whose voices count in terms of those debates? Belize is experiencing coastal squeeze, becoming more overloaded and overcrowded, and we can see this is obvious in places like Placencia, San Pedro, and rapidly developing Hopkins. Right? This puts pressure on the local way of life in the local environment and threatens the local economy. There are countless statements in numerous studies about the effects of sea level rise on low-lying coasts in Belize, but fewer studies on the pressure of economic and transnational migration to the shoreline. The squeeze itself is tied to space competition from businesses, developers, tourism resorts, and residential tourists or expats, right? Depending on how long people have been here and how they identify, how frequently they go back and forth to the US. The specific details of how the squeeze emerged in Belize has deep historical roots that set the stage for this very recent development of coastal tourism and real estate markets. This threatens the local population with, again, increasing land values, land shortages, and displacement from that beach landscape that is so culturally significant for them. So ultimately, the research question that I'm thinking through in this particular presentation is how this real estate boom and tourism economy has managed to manifest in Hopkins in this present moment. What are the conditions that made this moment of rapid change possible? So here you can see the old Castillo Beach sign and then the ever-present CPC sign, right? When you get when you get a boarding pass to fly on some of the regional airlines, oftentimes you'll have real estate literature stapled to the boarding pass, so before you even land, the idea of purchasing in Belize is put in the mind. So the theoretical perspective that I'm drawing from is rooted in political ecology and the perceptions of the environment. I do a lot of reading in the cross-disciplinary work on watery places and cultural landscapes, and the waterscape focus is a more recent field of coastal history that considers the local scale, looking at coastal studies of environmental history, focusing on anthropomorphic coasts and pristine natural shores, littoral and coastal societies. More specifically, this waterscape focus joins the conversation about two littoral spaces as far as I'm using it in my work, swamps and sandy beaches. While swamps are still regarded nervously, the features of the sandy beach are highly valued by society and used more than any other type of shore. In order to explain how the coasts of Belize, and specifically its sandy beaches, became objects of desire for tourists and residential tourists or expats, I draw on the concept of environmental imaginaries. Environmental imaginaries are the shared perceptions of the environment. They emerge from the array of ideas and explanations produced by people about particular landscapes and are derived from the way those landscapes are valued, experienced, lived, and worked. They shape socio-natural relationships and serve to explain the world and its characteristics. They reside only in our minds, but they act as springboards for how we perceive ourselves and interact with the human and non-human worlds. They also allow us to utilize the process and things we already understand by applying them to the unknown, providing a framework through which we perceive phenomena with which we're unfamiliar. So the wasteland is an environmental imaginary that shapes, I think, how the settlement and colony were regarded by the colonial office and people back in the colonial center. This was a culturally constructed, imagined representation of forests, swamps, and mountains, and it turned the settlement into a landscape of fear and contempt. It became an enduring trope, one that described what Great Britain is and defined what it is not. British Honduras as a wasteland served as a spatial other to European ideas of civilization and clarified which landscapes would be defined as picturesque by articulating what was grotesque. However, it's important to note that there's nothing natural about this assignment of this territory to the wasteland category. There's nothing inherent in Belize's topography that necessitates this degraded status. By applying the wasteland imaginary to the settlement, cultural attitudes designated it as marginal and peripheral, deserving of its low status in the geographic hierarchy. The wasteland imaginary works through two concepts: land's utility and disgust. Oh, backwards. Land's utility and disgust, sorry. First, land's value, starting in the 17th century, was perceived through the idea of use and uselessness. Was it being used? Could it be used? Useless land was wasteland. Disgust was the second social and moral concept. Some landscapes were perceived as offensive. Bad smells, for example, turned a place into a wasteland. What unites wastelands are not the characteristics that they share, but the things that they lack. Civilization and resources are absent there. They are also places that may harbor the wrong kinds of life, including flora and fauna, social outcasts, and the poor. Thus, they become perilous and frightening places. De Palma pointedly identifies swamps, forests, and mountains as those landscapes of the wasteland. Turning to the application of the wasteland concept in my analysis of the environmental imaginary of a pre-independence Belize, I found a discursive pattern suggesting that long before Belize was advertised as a tropical paradise, it was constructed as a swampy backwater. This negative representation of a useless place was most famously circulated by Aldous Huxley. There's a swamp for you. Okay. If the world had any ends, Belize would be one of them. It's not on the way from anywhere to anywhere else. It is all but uninhabited. Elsewhere, the swampy backwater was described as the swampy backwater of swampy backwaters. From the historical record, we can see that the fact that it remained unexplored for so long reflects this perception that this was a wasteland and the way in which people acted and perceived this space. Swamps were viscerally disgusting, mountains aesthetically disgusting and terrifying, and forests untamed, uncivilized, unproductive wilderness in need of improvement and thus morally disgusting. And the region remained unknown and misunderstood for a long period of time as a result of this. From the record, in 1733, someone sailing to Belize suggests that he's going to nothing larger than nothing better than a large sandbank and a place little better than a swamp covered with mangroves. Charles Sweat, in 1868, admitted in his travelogue that before arriving, all he knew about the place was the presence of rudely constructed buildings and equally rude people. It is singular but true, he wrote, that few persons who have not visited Belize have any well-defined or correct ideas of that place. And in 1890, British Honduras was still described as a little-known land with a half-explored interior. More recently, contemporary anthropologist Michael Chibnuk is only one of many ethnographers still reflecting on this swampy backwater designation, writing that as late as the 1970s, it was still a colonial possession scorned by travelers as a bizarrely isolated backwater. In fact, he chose to conduct his research here precisely because it was isolated and desolate. And socially, the swamp was a place that was filled with outcasts. Right? So when we think about the history of the buccaneers and the way in which they were represented throughout the literature, their drunkenness, their wildness, the custom of the bay, and the way in which they managed themselves and their resources, all of these things were thoroughly disparaged by people who were writing about them. Okay? As for the physical literal landscape, it was regarded as a swampy margin and reviled for reasons because, like, it was hard to travel through, it was scary, and it made people feel disgusted. The atmosphere was too rich and too thick with strong odors and dense forests and gruesome swamps. The hot, thick jungle air was insalubrious and would never have been selected for any habitation of men except there was a harbor. So these things were all perceived as being unhealthy and no good. In addition, the literal landscape was something ambiguous, couldn't be classified as either land or water, which was troubling in this environmental imaginary as well. Okay. There we go. Okay. Currently, there's a lived local fishing beach in the village. At this point, we can recognize that this marginal landscape wasn't only used in the colonial center, but it was used in the colony itself. And so when the Garifuna arrive on the shore in 1802 and ask for permission to come in, they are told they can labor, but they're relegated to the southern shores, right? Marginal people being sent to a marginal space despite the utility of their labor, right? But in this case, this is not a degraded landscape. This is perfect for this community of people who are already fishermen, who are already accustomed to living on the sea. The sea wasn't a scary space for them. And so today, this is a space of home, this is a space of family, this is a space of work and leisure, right? Okay. The third environmental imaginary, one that many of us are familiar with, is that of paradise. Paradise suggests that we can take a break from regular life and that there are abundant resources that are going to take care of everybody's problems. There's also the suspension of rules and obligations in places like paradise. And the paradise becomes a paradise beach, this universal global beach that's based on an image that comes from the South Pacific. It has these characteristics assigned to it and imagined as being exotic and unusual and isolated and inaccessible and secluded. Right? So what happens is that we get these different imaginaries coming into conflict. This swampy backwater that left Belize in an undeveloped state, a population who goes to the margin and makes a wonderful life on that margin, and then in the reinvention of how we're reading this landscape, the intrusion of this paradise imaginary that isn't generated locally, but is a globally circulating idea being mapped onto that landscape with tourist expectations attached to it. Right. So Belize is a swampy backwater. These same natural features are re-articulated as exotic, exclusive, and unknown in a place that was open to discovery. On its beaches, the exposed, unpredictable, unstable coastal margin between land and sea became reordered into a familiar scene of string hammocks and palm trees, sunshine, sand, and shore. The dense, uncontrolled rainforest of fear was reimagined as pristine and untouched, open to exploration and consumption in tourism. Literal forests were physically altered, reworked or removed, replaced by solid land through the technological processes of deforestation, draining, dredging, and filling. Untamed nature was domesticated into fertile gardens of flora and fauna. What comes of this conflict of these different and competing imaginaries is social and environmental stress, right? We see the potential for the land to be filled in the back of the village as a political issue that emerged a couple of years ago. right? We see the swamp being transformed for luxury housing for those snowbirds who may come down for just a couple weeks a year, right? So in summation, we have these environmental imaginaries of the wasteland, the swampy backwater, the local lived fishing beach, and the paradise beach. When they come into contact, right, you've got a real estate and a tourism boom where the tensions are high. Okay? You've got social conflicts and these dramatic incidences of environmental transformation.